March 18, 1945. U.S. Army Field Hospital 87, outskirts of Manila. The air was wrong. It wasn't the metallic cordite of artillery or the copper-sweet rot of the jungle. It was thick, humid, and smelled of boiled onions, hot oil, and fish. Akiko Tanaka's hands were raw. She gripped the wooden handle of a large metal spoon, scraping it against the thick, bubbled glass of a Pyrex dish. The sound set her teeth on edge, worse than a scalpel on bone. In the dish, a pale, gray-yellow sludge congealed. Chunks of tuna, boiled noodles, and gelatinous cream. It was a food of nightmares. A shadow fell over her. A young American MP, his M1 helmet liner slick with sweat, leaned against the tent pole. "Smells like home, nurse," he mumbled, his voice thick with a strange nasal accent. Akiko looked from the sludge to the MP, then to the rows of cots where wounded Americans lay. Her own surgical scissors, confiscated and humiliatingly returned, rested on the counter, stained not with blood, but with mushroom soup from a Campbell's can. She felt a tremor of revulsion, a deep cultural vertigo. This was her duty now, not healing, not saving, feeding the enemy. 4 months earlier, Leyte. 4 months earlier. Leyte, November 1944. The world had shrunk to the canvas roof of the aid station, and the canvas was leaking. A steady, lukewarm drip of jungle rain spattered onto Akiko Tanaka's forehead. She ignored it, her focus absolute, narrowed to the beam of a failing flashlight held by a trembling private. Beneath her hands, a soldier's calf muscle gaped open, a dark canyon of shredded tissue and mud. She was out of anesthetic. She had been out of anesthetic for 3 weeks. "Osairu," she commanded, "hold him." The private pressed his meager weight onto the soldier's chest. The man beneath her didn't scream. He was too far gone, his breathing a shallow, wet rattle. Akiko worked with a swift, mechanical precision. Her fingers, raw from scrubbing with harsh lye soap, moved deftly, pulling the fishing line she used for sutures through the resistant flesh. The air was a thick, oppressive blanket of humidity, mildew, and gangrene. The artillery was closer now. The ground didn't just shake, it jumped, sending puffs of dust from the tent poles. She tied the final knot, a perfect surgeon's square, and cut the line with her scissors. It was useless, she knew. Without antibiotics, the infection was already systemic. But this was her duty. Her hachimaki headband, once white, was stiff with dried blood, both hers and others. A high-pitched whistle sliced the air, ending in a deafening roar. The world dissolved. Canvas, mud, and the man holding the flashlight vanished in a flash of pressurized heat. Akiko was thrown against the stacked, empty medical crates. Her ears screamed. She tasted dirt and cordite. She pushed herself up, her limbs heavy, her vision swimming. The aid station was gone. There was only rain, falling into a new, raw crater. The shelling stopped. The silence that rushed in was more terrifying. It was filled with a new sound. Not the shuffling tabby of her comrades, heavy boots, and voices, sharp and nasal, speaking in a language she had been taught to despise. English. She was hauled to her feet by a rough hand on her upper arm. The world swam back into focus, dominated by giants in olive drab green. They were enormous, their faces slick with sweat and rain under the heavy steel domes of their M1 helmets. They smelled of wet wool, tobacco, and a faint, sweet odor she couldn't place. One of them, a corporal with dark stubble, barked a question. The language was meaningless, a series of harsh, barking sounds. He pointed at her. "What the hell we got here, Sarge? A nurse?" Another soldier, older, spat. "Who cares? Check her." Akiko froze, her spine rigid. This is it, she thought. The moment of dishonor. Her training had been clear. Death before capture. She had failed. Now came the price. The corporal reached for the stained canvas medical satchel still slung across her body. She flinched, not from fear, but from a profound sense of violation. He ripped it from her shoulder, dumped its contents onto the muddy ground. A few remaining rolled bandages, an empty morphine syringe, a notepad dark with rain, and her surgical scissors. The corporal picked them up, the fine steel gleaming dully. He tested the blades, whistling. Nice souvenir. He pocketed them. The theft felt more intimate than a physical blow. Those scissors were an extension of her hands, her skill, her identity. Without them, she was nothing. He then moved to pat down her uniform. Akiko shut her eyes, bracing for the humiliation, her entire body tensing like wire. "Knock it off, Casey." A new voice. This one calmer, with more authority. Akiko opened her eyes. A soldier with a Red Cross armband on his helmet liner was kneeling, looking not at her, but at the nurse's insignia patch on her sleeve. He tapped it. "She's medical. Geneva," he said, the one word cutting through the noise. He looked back at the corporal. "She's not a rifleman. Get her tagged and move her to the rear with the other POWs. Separately." The corporal grumbled, but stepped back. The medic looked at Akiko, his expression unreadable. Not kind, not cruel, just procedural. He looped a paper tag with a wire through her buttonhole. She had been prepared for brutality. She had rehearsed the words of defiance, the final Tino Heika Banzai. She was not prepared for this detached bureaucratic efficiency, this baffling, orderly processing of her ultimate shame. They pushed her toward a waiting truck, joining a line of silent, defeated Japanese men. The unreality of it was suffocating. She was alive, unharmed, and a prisoner. The truck ride was a blur of jolting misery, ending in a place that defied comprehension. It wasn't a hospital. It was a city of canvas tents, sprawling across acres of churned mud, buzzing like a mechanical hive. Jeeps and heavy trucks roared past, throwing up spray. The air hummed with the thrum of generators and smelled powerfully of diesel exhaust and boiling coffee. Akiko was shoved out into this chaos. She saw hundreds of men in cots, lines of wounded waiting, and medical personnel moving with a frantic, industrial energy. This was the American war machine, and its scale was terrifying. For 2 days, she was invisible, kept in a holding pen with a few other captured non-combatants. She watched the medical tents, her instincts screaming. She was a nurse. They were overwhelmed. She could help. She tried to signal this to a passing medic, making a gesture of bandaging. He glanced at her, then just shook his head. "Stay put, Tojo." Uselessness was a cold, creeping dread. In the Imperial Army, the useless were a burden. A burden was dishonorable. Dishonor was death. On the third morning, a new kind of soldier approached. This one was built like a rice bale, with thick arms and a ruddy, perpetually annoyed face. His helmet liner bore no Red Cross, only sergeant stripes. He wasn't a healer. He was a laborer. He scanned the pen, his eyes landing on Akiko. He grunted, unlocked the gate, and crooked a thick finger. "You out." He didn't wait. Akiko scrambled to follow, her heart pounding with a new, uncertain fear. He wasn't taking her to the surgical tents. He bypassed the rows of wounded, marching her past the generators, toward a massive tent at the rear from which clouds of steam and smoke billowed. The mess tent. The sergeant, Miller, his name tape read, pushed her inside. The heat and noise were overwhelming. Men shouted over the clatter of massive pots, the hiss of boiling water. Sergeant Miller grabbed something from a box of confiscated items and shoved it into her chest. Akiko looked down. It was her surgical scissors. She looked up at him, confused. Was she to operate? Miller pointed, not at a patient, but at a mountain of wooden crates stacked against the canvas wall. One was stenciled, K-ration, breakfast. He tapped the crate, then made a sharp, cutting gesture with his fingers. Open, he commanded. You open. The scissors felt heavy in her hand, suddenly alien. The fine German steel, meant for sutures and debridement, was now a box cutter. This was not a reprieve. This was her new uniform. This was her new duty. Her duty evolved from opening crates to processing their contents. A freckled American cook, barely 20, was her instructor. He didn't speak. He demonstrated, his movements quick and impatient. He pointed to a stack of cans. Tuna. He made a draining motion. He pointed to another can, this one red and white. Soup. He pointed to a bag of dry, pale noodles. Noodles. He pantomimed, mixing them all together in a large, absurdly heavy glass dish, a Pyrex. Akiko watched, her mind struggling to categorize the procedure. This was not cooking. It was assembly. Her first task was the cans. She picked up her surgical scissors. The fine steel felt obscene as she punctured the lid of a tuna can. Oily water streamed out, smelling of stale ocean. She repeated the motion, her clinical precision now dedicated to this mindless, repetitive task. Then came the soup. The red and white label depicted a food she did not recognize. She pierced the lid. The click of the metal yielding was precise. She pried it open. A thick, pale gray sludge oozed out, clinging to the metal. The smell hit her instantly, a heavy, artificial fungal odor mixed with thickened milk. It was the smell of rot, of something long dead pretending to be food. She gagged, a visceral full-body rejection. Her stomach clenched. This was not food. It was industrial waste. The cook glanced at her, annoyed. "Hey, hurry it up!" Akiko forced down the bile. She scraped the gelatinous muck into the Pyrex dish. She added the drained fish, the brittle noodles. She mixed. The sound of the spoon scraping the glass was like nails on slate. The resulting paste was a uniform, repulsive gray-yellow. She felt a profound sense of cultural vertigo, a deep cellular disgust. In her homeland, food was simple. Rice, fish, a pickled vegetable. It was clean, defined, honest. This was a violation. It was the food of barbarians. She was not a nurse. She was not even a cook. She was an accomplice, preparing a strange poison for her jailers. The heavy Pyrex dish, now full, felt like a weapon. The heavy Pyrex dish was placed on the serving line, steam rising from its gray-yellow surface. Akiko stood back, her arms crossed tightly, a silent observer of her own repulsive work. Wounded men shuffled past, their olive-drab fatigue stained with sweat and dirt. They held out their metal mess kits with a tired familiarity. The American cook scooped a large, gelatinous spoonful onto each kit. Akiko watched their faces, expecting grimaces of disgust, perhaps even refusal. She had been taught that Americans were weak, raised on sugar and meaningless luxuries, incapable of enduring hardship or real food. But there was no disgust. A young GI, his arm in a fresh white cast, looked down at the steaming pile. A slow, genuine smile spread across his chapped lips. He inhaled deeply. Man, I needed this. Another soldier, pale and trembling from malaria, took his kit to a nearby bench. He ate quickly, almost desperately, his eyes closing in, something that looked disturbingly like relief. Then came the one she would remember. He was badly wounded, his head wrapped in bandages, and he moved with agonizing slowness. He accepted the food, his hands shaking. He lifted the spoon to his mouth, tasted it, and froze. Akiko watched him, tensing. The soldier's shoulders slumped. He lowered his head, and for a moment she thought he was weeping. He looked up, his eyes finding hers. He didn't see a prisoner. He just saw the person who had served him. "Smells like home, nurse," he whispered, his voice thick. Akiko stared, rooted to the spot. A profound, seismic shock ran through her. Home. This sludge reminded them of home. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. This poison was their comfort. This industrial assembly was their umeboshi, their bowl of rice. It was the taste that connected them, across an ocean, to a place of safety and belonging. Her entire framework of the enemy, as weak as barbarian, cracked. They were not repulsed. They were comforted. The disgust was hers alone, a cultural island in the sea of alien appreciation. The duty had just become infinitely more confusing. The frantic lunch rush subsided, leaving the mess tent humid and quiet, save for the sound of scrubbing. Akiko was wiping down the stainless steel counter when Sergeant Miller approached. He was holding a metal mess kit. On it was a scoop of the tuna casserole, still steaming. He held it out to her. It was not a command. It was not an act of kindness. It was simple logistics. The kitchen staff ate what was left. He grunted, "Chow." Akiko looked at the plate. The gray-yellow mixture, which she now understood was a source of comfort for the enemy, still looked like poison to her. But it was more than that. Her own people, her comrades, were at this very moment starving in the jungles of Leyte, perhaps eating roots and insects, if they were lucky. To eat this rich, enemy food, this symbol of their overwhelming, wasteful power, felt like the final, unforgivable act of betrayal. It was an assimilation. It was surrender. She could feel the gnawing emptiness in her own stomach. Her body, pragmatic and weak, screamed for the calories, the fat, the salt. She had subsisted for days on the meager POW ration, a small ball of rice and a few strips of pickled daikon. It was barely enough to keep her standing. Sergeant Miller waited, his expression impatient. Akiko straightened her back. She placed her hands formally at her sides, looked at a point just past his shoulder, and executed a short, stiff bow. She did not reach for the plate. Miller stared at her for a long second. He seemed confused, then annoyed. "Suit yourself." He dumped the casserole into the trash bin with a wet slap and stalked off. Akiko turned back to the counter, her hands shaking slightly. She had won. She had maintained her purity. She had refused to be assimilated. A moment later, her stomach cramped violently, a sharp, acidic pain that doubled her over. The scent of the casserole lingered in the air, no longer just repulsive, but now a mockery. Her ideology had won the battle, but her body had just declared war. A week later, the familiar, chaotic rhythm of the hospital was broken. A new truck arrived, but it bypassed the main medical tents. It stopped near the POW holding area, and the men who stumbled out were not Americans. They were Japanese. Akiko watched from the flap of the mess tent, her hands frozen mid-task. These were not the soldiers she remembered from Leyte. These were skeletons draped in rotted uniforms, their eyes burning with fever and a hollow, haunted look. They were stragglers, hunted down in the mountains, survivors of a defense that had long since collapsed into starvation. They smelled of sickness, of damp earth, and of death. They were segregated in a small tent near the latrines, treated with a mixture of suspicion and clinical detachment. Akiko felt an agonizing pull, a loyalty that superseded her status as a prisoner. They were her people. She watched as a U.S. medic, the same one who had tagged her, entered their tent. He was pragmatic, carrying a crate of K rations. Akiko crept closer, hiding behind a stack of empty fuel drums. She could see through the tent flap. The medic knelt by one soldier, a man delirious with malaria, his skin a waxy yellow. The medic tore open a K-ration packet and offered him the small tin of processed cheese. The Japanese soldier stared at the yellow paste. He gathered what little strength he had, hissing, "Kichiku!" "Beast!" He struck the can from the medic's hand, spattering the cheese on the tent wall. He then began to cough, a dry, racking sound that shook his entire frame, and he spat violently at the American's feet. The medic swore, stood up, and left the tent, shaking his head. Akiko sank back against the drums, her legs weak. Despair washed over her, cold and absolute. The soldier was dying. His wounds were treatable, his fever manageable. But he would die of starvation here, surrounded by food, because his pride, his indoctrination, told him this help was a contamination. Her training as a nurse screamed at her to intervene, but she had no medicine. She had no authority. She had nothing, nothing except the knowledge of how to make the gray, disgusting sludge that the Americans called home. Akiko moved without thinking. The act was a reflex, born of years of triage. A dying patient needed calories. She possessed the calories. All other considerations, honor, disgust, loyalty, evaporated. She returned to the mess tent. The American cooks were on a break, smoking cigarettes outside. The main serving line was cold. But in the oven, a fresh Pyrex dish, prepared for the evening medical staff, was still hot. Her hands moved with the swift, impersonal precision of the operating theater. She grabbed a metal mess kit. She scooped it full of the hot casserole. The smell, the one that had made her gag, was now irrelevant. She registered it only as nutrition: fat, salt, carbohydrates. She moved back across the compound, keeping to the shadows of the tents. The risk was enormous. If Sergeant Miller caught her, it was theft of U.S. Army property. If the other Japanese POWs saw her, it was collaboration, feeding one of their own with the enemy's decadent filth. She slipped into the segregation tent. The air was foul. The sick soldier was lying on his cot, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow. Akiko knelt beside him. "Heishi-san." "Soldier?" His eyes cracked open, dull and unfocused. He saw her. "Nani?" "What?" She held out the mess kit. He stared at the gray-yellow sludge, his lips pulled back in a grimace of profound disgust. "Iramu. Don't want it." He turned his head away. "You must," Akiko said, her voice a low command. This was not a request. It was a procedure. She scooped up a small amount. "This is medicine." He refused, clenching his jaw. Akiko's patience snapped. She was a nurse, and this was a patient. She grabbed his chin, her grip surprisingly strong, forcing his head back. Before he could resist, she pushed the spoon past his teeth, scraping it against his tongue, just as she would force a quinine pill down a delirious throat. "Ikiru!" she commanded. "Live!" The soldier gagged, his whole body tense to spit it out, but he was too weak. The salt, the fat, the sudden, shocking burst of calories hit his starved palate. His body, smarter than his pride, betrayed him. He swallowed. Akiko quickly loaded the spoon again and pushed it in. He swallowed again. This time, his resistance was weaker. It was no longer food. It was fuel. The ingredients from the Campbell's can, once a symbol of her humiliation, were now the only tools she had left to save a life. The transgression became a system. The Japanese soldier lived, and Akiko now had a new, secret imperative that operated beneath her official duty. She was no longer just feeding the enemy. She was diverting resources. To do this, she needed to become essential. She attacked the casserole preparation with a new, terrifying focus. Her disgust was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical drive for efficiency. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a logistician of calories. She observed the American cooks. They were sloppy. They left half scoops of soup in the Campbell's cans. They spilled noodles. They misjudged the baking times, scorching the edges of one Pyrex dish while leaving another undercooked. It was wasteful. Akiko stepped in. She organized the prep station like a surgical tray. She used her surgical scissors with a speed that baffled the other staff. Shh, click, shh, click. Each can was opened with 3 precise punctures, the lid peeled back, the contents scraped clean with a rubber spatula. Not a single drop of the precious, high-fat gray sludge was wasted. She established an assembly line. Tuna, soup, noodles, mix, scrape, fill, level. She timed the ovens, rotating the heavy Pyrex dishes with a rhythm that maximized output. Sergeant Miller watched her. He saw a prisoner working with the obsessive, inhuman efficiency his propaganda had told him to expect. He didn't see a nurse diverting resources. He saw a good Jap finally making herself useful. After 2 days of this manic output, he grunted with approval. "All right, nurse, the casserole's yours. You're in charge of it. Don't screw it up." It was a victory. Akiko bowed stiffly, her expression blank, her mind already calculating. By controlling the production, she controlled the surplus. Every 5th dish, she made slightly fuller. Every 10th scoop, she scraped slightly less. The small excesses, invisible to Miller, were skimmed off, collected, and smuggled nightly to the small, segregated tent. She had become the master of this alien craft, a surgeon whose operating theater was a mess hall, and whose tools were canned goods. She was saving lives, one repulsive, high-calorie spoonful at a time. The crisis arrived with the sound of the wind. A typhoon had been howling for 2 days, turning the compound into a lake of mud. The rain hammered the canvas roof so loudly it drowned out all other sound. And the supply trucks had not come. Sergeant Miller was enraged, his face purple. The main stores were almost empty. Then, worse, the jeeps arrived. They skidded to a halt outside the surgical tents, unloading new casualties. A mopping-up operation in Manila's sewers had gone wrong. A trapped unit of Japanese holdouts had fought back with grenades. The hospital was instantly overwhelmed. Wounded men, both American and Japanese, were laid on stretchers in the walkways. The generators sputtered as water seeped in. The head nurse, an American woman named Lieutenant Davis, burst into the mess tent, her face pale. "Miller, we need food, hot food. We have 30 new casualties, and my existing patients haven't eaten." "Eaten what?" Miller roared, gesturing at the empty shelves. "The trucks are stuck. I got crackers, I got coffee, and I got her." He jabbed a finger at Akiko. "I got 4 cans of tuna and 2 cans of soup. That's it. That's everything." The tent descended into chaos. The other cooks stared, paralyzed. Lieutenant Davis looked faint. Miller kicked an empty crate. In that moment of paralysis, Akiko moved. She walked past the frantic sergeant. She picked up the single, large, cold Pyrex dish. She turned to the 2 Filipino kitchen hands and the other POWs. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise of the rain and the shouting. It was the voice of a triage nurse in a collapsed aid station. "Oh, you," she commanded. "Hot water." She pointed to the stove. To another, "K-ration." She made a crushing motion with her hands. The men stared. She turned to Miller. She pointed at the 2 cans of soup, then made a stretching, diluting motion with her hands. "Water, more, stretch." She pointed to the crackers. "Topping, crush." Miller and Davis just looked at her, stunned. Akiko ignored them. She was no longer a prisoner, no longer a cook. She was the only person in the room who knew how to turn nothing into something. She was the only one with a plan. She was, once again, in charge of saving lives. The stunned silence broke. Sergeant Miller, seeing a plan, any plan, in motion, barked, "Do what she says!" Akiko's kitchen became a field hospital. She tore open the 2 cans of cream of mushroom soup with her scissors, scraping them into the Pyrex dish. She added boiling water, diluting the thick sludge into a thin gray broth. She ripped open the 4 cans of tuna, adding the fish. It was not enough. "K-ration!" she shouted again. A POW brought the crate. Akiko seized her scissors. Shh, click, shh, click. She didn't open the boxes. She attacked them, pulling out the small packets of crackers. She shoved them at the Filipino cooks. "Crush! Now!" They smashed the crackers with the bottoms of empty cans, turning them into a coarse meal. Akiko dumped this into the mixture. It was a desperate, ugly improvisation. The crackers would absorb the watery broth, expand, and create bulk. It wouldn't be nutritious, but it would be hot, and it would be calories. She mixed the slop, shoved the dish into the oven, and began organizing the line. She took every remaining K-ration cracker, every stale piece of bread, and laid them out. She would serve a small scoop of the hot mixture on top of a single cracker. Triage. The oven timer dinged. She pulled the heavy Pyrex dish out. The smell filled the tent, thick, humid, a bizarre mix of boiled onions, hot oil, and fish. A young MP, soaked from the storm, leaned in through the tent flap, guarding the entrance. "Smells like home, nurse," he mumbled, his voice tired. Akiko looked up at him. The words which had once baffled her now landed with perfect clarity. He wasn't talking about the food. He was talking about the smell of a hot oven in a storm, the smell of effort, the promise of sustenance. She nodded at him, a single curt gesture of mutual understanding. She placed the dish on the line. Wounded men, American GIs, and Japanese POWs side by side were shuffled past. Akiko took the spoon. She was no longer a slave performing a disgusting ritual. She was a provider, executing a vital procedure. She scooped the hot gray paste onto a cracker. She handed it to a GI. He ate. She scooped again. She handed it to a Japanese prisoner. He ate. The definition of nutrition had collapsed. The lines between enemy food and sustenance had blurred into nothing. There was only the storm, the wounded, and the calories. The storm passed. The supply lines reopened. The war, however, simply stopped. The news came in August, not as a celebration, but as a stunned, confused silence that fell over the entire compound. The emperor had spoken. The war was over. Akiko's duty in the mess tent ended. She was just a prisoner again, waiting. The tuna casserole duty was finished. The Japanese wounded she had fed were moved to a more permanent facility. She was scheduled for repatriation. She found herself adrift, her identity completely unmoored. She was not the imperial nurse who had charged into Leyte, headband tight, ready for an honorable death. She was not the prisoner who had recoiled in disgust from a can of soup. She was something else, something forged in the pragmatic heat of the mess tent ovens. On her final day, she was collecting her few possessions: a worn blanket, a bar of lye soap. Sergeant Miller found her by the empty Pyrex dishes, now stacked and clean. He stood there awkwardly, his hands in his pockets, looking at the ovens. "Heard you're shipping out," he said. Akiko nodded, bowing slightly. He fumbled in his pocket, then pressed something small, sharp, and metallic into her hand. He didn't say thank you or good luck. He just grunted, "Souvenir." Akiko opened her palm. It wasn't her surgical scissors. Those were long gone, a relic of a different life. It was a P-38 can opener, a tiny hinged piece of stamped American steel designed to open K-rations, the antithesis of her fine, precise medical tools. It was ugly, brutally functional, and mass-produced. She closed her fingers around the sharp metal. This was the tool that had truly defined her survival. Not the scalpel, but the can opener. She looked up at Miller, then at the kitchen, the source of her humiliation and her unexpected salvation. She finally understood. Healing was not always clean. Nutrition was not always recognizable. Sometimes it was just a gray, ugly paste in a glass dish. Sometimes it was just the base, biological imperative of calories. It was simply whatever it took to keep a human being alive.